Today, I've got Dr. Seppe Cassettari, who's with me today, who I've known for several years. So welcome. Thanks for joining me, Seppe.
You're welcome. Delighted to be here.
Great, and great to have you. So, as with the other people I've had on the podcast, I asked them to introduce themselves, if you would. Of course, I know you well, and also just a bit about your background. So that's a key thing, and for people watching this, the assumption is that people watching or listening are new, perhaps, to whatever sectors we talk about, completely brand new. So if you could just introduce yourself and your background and how you do what you do today, that'd be great. Thank you.
Right. Yeah. Well, hi everybody. As Stephen said, Seppe Cassettari. Seppe is short for Giuseppe, so Italian roots there, but born and bred in London, as the accent probably gives away. Always been interested in geography, in particular maps, and perhaps in my younger days in geology and surveying. And that's actually where I started off. I did a degree at London University in geography and surveying and geology. And my whole career, that was back in late 1970s. So I'm pretty long in the tooth. I've been in the geospatial industry for a long time, and I've seen a lot of change. I've also been lucky that my career has spread across a wide range of activities. I spent 10 years working for the Ministry of Defence in the UK on mapping related issues. We won't go into any more of that, but it was a really fascinating and formative time for me. But they also sponsored me to do a PhD in the middle of the 1980s. So for those of you listening who are long enough in the tooth to remember that far back, you'll know those were the very early days of GIS. It was just emerging as a technology. There were the very first installations of ArcInfo, as it was called at the time. And I was doing a PhD in researching how that could be used for some military applications. That sort of kicked off my career beyond the military. I ended up lecturing at Kingston University, where I ran the undergraduate program. I set it up and ran it for a few years, which was a very successful, very interesting approach to getting people with a lot of technical skills out into the workplace. And I'm still in touch with people who are on that course, still working in the geospatial industry. I then moved on and went and worked for a large corporate publishing house. And I was involved in some of the early magazine publishing in Europe. So there was a magazine in the US called GIS World. They decided to publish GIS Europe, and I became the editor of that. And subsequently, that magazine and the company in the US was acquired by a UK publishing house, and I became the managing director of that business. So I had an interesting experience and big learning curve and how you put together technology specialist publications. And we did conferences and magazines and events all around the world. And we ended up publishing in Singapore, in South Africa, US, Canada. So, and all those markets have subtly different impacts in the way they look at mapping and geospatial. And that sort of added to my experience. But eventually Pearson, which was the company that acquired all of this, decided it was time to move out of that area. And I got the opportunity to do a management buyout, which led me to owning my own company, which was the GeoInformation Group, back in 1998. And I did that for 18 years before I sold it on. GeoInformation Group started off in its early days using some research I'd done at Kingston, which was to look at aerial surveys and how you could publish those. So I won't show you here, but one of my favorite photographs is my database of central London, which we did in 1994 at 25 centimeter resolution for aerial imagery, much the same as we're doing today. As Google and people like that came into the market and sort of productized the whole aerial survey industry, we moved on to collecting more value-added data or information, and we can talk a bit about that whole issue later on. But we got involved in that, and we created things like UKMap, which was the 1 to 1,000 scale map of central London, or the whole of London actually. We did some building classification databases and things like that. And eventually I sold that out, got involved with an insurance company. And now I'm actually retired. So I've done all that time, but I haven't left the industry completely. I'm still around it. And I'm currently president of the British Cartographic Society. So I keep my hand in, and I still like to know what's going on. And I still like to encourage and get involved with people who are just starting out in the industry or trying to work out how they're going to use geospatial data. So that's me in a nutshell.
Great, thanks, Seppe. And I think it's really interesting your career and how you've moved through, you know, from defence into imagery, and obviously cartography has been a huge part of that, and geospatial. And of course, the audience potentially watching and listening to this doesn't have either a mapping, a cartographic background, or a geospatial background again. So there'll be some principles certainly that are common in data management. I just thought, so thank you first of all. I just thought I'd ask you, just go straight for it and ask you about sort of visualization. I know there's so much we could talk about, and we'll probably get onto other aspects, but that's a term that I see come up quite a lot nowadays through other channels, let's put it that way, talking about data visualization, and it doesn't have to necessarily be mapped, but often that's part of it. I think I mean, it's an open question. I mean, what is your take on the fact that we've got lots of other people, non-cartographic people, talking about visualization? Is this a good thing? Does it dilute the profession? Have you got any thoughts on that?
Oh, I think it's an excellent thing. I mean, it's visualization is a way of communicating data or information, and it's all about how we communicate things. Most people, many people, I won't say most, many people love maps. They like to look at them, they like to use them, and they, you know, you go to a show or something and you put maps on the wall and historic maps, people are fascinated by them. It's because that picture, which represents a world that they understand or know about, they can relate to. So maps are a very good way of communicating information, but they can also be a very bad way of doing it because they have so much data within them. So how we visualize is really important. And a lot of the new technologies, the new ways of re-representing a map and all of the other things that go with it are actually helping us get better communication. So the standard map, you know, it's the skills that are required to interpret a standard map are actually something that not many people have. And so having different ways to communicate through different ways of visualizing space is all to the good.
I think you're saying, but that skill as well, I've noticed that. So because people won't know who I am necessarily, my career progression is from cartography and then GIS, and still cartography is part of it, the mapping aspect. But having that original foundation, I think, is valuable, which is I say simply, but oftentimes just simply thinking, what will people be thinking when they look at this map or this dashboard, actually putting yourselves in them shoes. And I see that all the time in other sort of non-spatial, particularly data representation, that people simply don't think. They're not thinking about what the end user. Have you got anything to add on that? Maybe any use cases that aren't too sensitive to share about where you've seen that done well, or maybe where you've seen improvement. Yeah.
Talk about use cases, maybe they'll pop into my head in a minute.
Sure.
But you're right. It's really important that people think about how you interpret what you look at. You've got to bear in mind that a map, all maps are interpretations already. They're extractions of the real world or the data that's been collected. And somebody has put together some way of representing them. And certain things you expect the sea to be blue, and you know, and certain types of relief shading you're familiar with, and you get same colors for roads. But actually, we can be much more creative and stimulate different things. Maps have been used to communicate completely inappropriate information. There's plenty of examples of propaganda maps, you know, giving examples where people look at them and go, "Oh, that's what that means," and that's not the truth or reality. And pictures are very good at doing that, and that's what a map is. So how you structure, how you put that together is really quite important. So the skills of a cartographer are still very important with this. That's not to say other people with artistic skills or design skills can't contribute to that, But there is an element of understanding the data properly so that when you put together a map, it actually conforms to certain standards that people expect, so they can then extract from that the correct information that you're trying to communicate.
Yeah, thank you. That's so true that there's a potential danger of people not having them skills. I know we've already identified that point, but I often think of it like a cumulative or compound risk, something like that. Like there's more data that's created than ever before, and everyone's, as we know, got sensors and all this kind of stuff. And you think there's more data out there, there's more chance of people without these skills doing work with it and presenting it, and I think it's a risk. So I think certainly education. I didn't know, maybe this is a segue into the BCS Geoviz. I wasn't necessarily going to explicitly mention that, but I think maybe now, would you like to just introduce what that is and how that came about?
So the British Cartographic Society has always had a remit to promote better mapping, one form or another. And we had a program actually for many years called Better Mapping. We went out and we did roadshows and hands-on workshops where we showed people how you can use current solutions that are available to everybody and how you can produce better maps from it. We realize now that actually the technology is changing, it's actually improving, and we've got a much more varied set of technologies that you can use now. So we've sort of recreated that program as Geoviz, so Geographic or Geospatial Visualization, with the idea that we start talking to people who have different skills. And you've mentioned dashboards. I mean, that is a thing that's fairly recent in terms of the way people look at various different sorts of information in one consolidated graphic and then extract from that. But how you get that right, get the balance between the map, the pie chart, the whatever, is really important, because people will focus in on a certain element within complex graphics. So Geoviz is about encouraging people to do that in a better way. And our first part of that program is that we've linked up with the government geography profession here in the UK to help them produce better maps as part of the documents that government uses, with some standard techniques and styles or ways of approaching it. If you take Ordnance Survey standard open data, what's the best way of presenting that? What's the best way of doing a map in a briefing document that can only be 2 pages long? All of those sorts of questions that we're looking at.
Yeah, so it's really interesting that you're reaching out to as well as cartographers and other people, map makers that aren't professional full-time map makers, and that's where most people are in society, aren't they? Again, it's self-evident, and I know we've touched on this already, but now people have that capability, like you've identified with the tools. There is that need. So I think it's excellent, and I've seen similar. I've seen the term used, geovisualization, elsewhere as well, not necessarily that initiative, but I think just maybe moving into that theme about skills, what do you see as the single big, if we haven't mentioned it already, single biggest skills gap? So again, sorry to put you on the spot, we haven't done this in advance, but and it could be around data. Obviously the implication is because of who we are, it's going to be around cartography and geospatial, and it probably will be, but just generally around information management, what don't people get right, or what generally do they need help with? Because
that's a big question, but it is. It used to be, so if I just start with the cartographic end, used to be that we had specialist courses in the UK that focused on how to make a map. A large part of that was the visualization of the end product. If I've gone out and surveyed a road, how am I going to represent that in some generalized interpretive form on a piece of paper? All of those courses have gone. We have some elements where there is cartographic skills training going on in certain other broader courses, places like Glasgow University, for example, but we have far less of those skills. We sort of tend to rely on the packages to do the work. And the packages are, the standard that you get out of a package when you pump some data in is pretty limited. It isn't very creative. It isn't actually necessarily doing you a favor in terms of getting the right communication. So we've let some of those skills go. Now, at the same time, we've been bringing in lots of skills in terms of data collection. There's lots more surveying courses. And here, what I would do is make a really big definition between data and information. That level of where we're collecting primary, and then we add to that primary some sort of interpretation, or we classification, or we merge two data sets together, and we get something that gives us a more valuable piece of information. People don't often make those distinctions, and they don't therefore think about how they're going to represent the answer. So if I get some raw data and I look at that data and represent it purely as it was collected, and then I change it and represent it again in a different way, I don't think about necessarily what I've got to communicate to the user in terms of them understanding the changes that have been made. Now, that's sort of what cartography is trying to do. It's trying to communicate to the end user how I've interpreted something, how I've put something in a certain classification. We've sort of moved away from that because we've all got these basic skills now, these tools, and we don't worry about things like that, which comes back to your point. You were talking about data quality. I mean, fundamentally, we have a big issue with how we manage data quality. So that, I mean, that's another subject, but yeah, we have a skills gap. We definitely have a skill shortage.
Yeah, thank you. And I think that's where it's in the back of my mind. I think there's a I don't want to be pessimistic, but like a tsunami of challenges coming if we've got more and more data. I know we've got machine learning, AI, and all the rest of it. However, as I've already mentioned, there's all this data being created, and it's something has to be done now. After, I don't know if you've got anything to add. I know you've sort of touched on it then around metadata, but again, there'll be people potentially watching or listening to this that don't even know what metadata is, particularly if you're not from this profession. So I think if you've got anything to add about metadata, I mean, that's
metadata is one. Well, metadata is one of those things every data set should have, and very few of them do. It describes, it's data about data. It's the description of what that data set is, how it was collected, when it was collected, what were the parameters of the collection. There are standards, that we have an ISO standard here in the UK. Remember the numbers, 19115, I believe, which came out in 2003, something like that. Well, you can quote me, but I might have got it wrong. But there's standards within the defense community. The US have standards. There's the Open Geospatial Consortium has standards, all trying to make people record what it is they've done when they've collected a piece of data. And we're all terrible at doing it because there's no kudos in doing it. The trouble is, if I pick up a data set and I start doing something with it, I don't understand all the parameters about how it was collected and why, and the limitations of those collections. Any errors, any problems with that data just get passed on through. And as I move up that sort of chain from data to information to eventually to knowledge and some decision-making process, I end up with having perpetuated potentially errors, or even made them worse because I didn't understand what the limitations of the data set were. I mean, the best example of that is the number of times you see people who make a map. They'll take Ordnance Survey open data, which was created at 1 to 25,000 scale, and they'll merge it with a bit of master map that they have that they're working in at 1 to 1250 scale. And then they wonder why it doesn't map. In fact, the best example, if you think about online mapping today, if you go and look at the BBC, online service, and you look at the maps of Ukraine, and you compare the two maps between the borders of Ukraine and the countries around it, compared with the map showing the Russian areas, the Ukrainian areas, and the two boundaries don't meet. They're taken from different sources, they don't match. And you think, well, why didn't they just use the same source so that the boundaries are all the same? And it's that sort of misunderstanding about not understanding where the data came from. We're all really bad at it, but we really ought to have a refocus back on metadata.
Yeah, so thank you for that. I think quite rightly, we not us personally, but some people in the industries around geospatial and information and data management should. But I think a lot of people I talk to are not necessarily data professionals of any description on a daily basis, and they don't. There's no refocus. It's just they need a way in to say, like in the example you give. I think that is a huge challenge. The only time I'd ever heard metadata used was either in a geospatial GIS context or in a defense type context, and that was about seeing who called who type thing, which made it into the newspapers a few years ago for reasons, sadly. But other than that, it's not a common word, I don't think. But anyway, so I think we've made the point there. What I'll also do is link any of these topics. The other point of this podcast is anything we draw out as a topic, then I'll link to it. So I will link to OGC. There's also Gemini 2, I think, is the AGI has custodianship over that BSI. Yeah. And of course, that is linked to the ISO that you're referring to. So great. And I think it'd be interesting to know if you want to share currently what you're working on, if you can say, or is there anything you want to share, one of the more recent projects? Because
well, I mean, I say
what can you say? Well, one of the last things you did that you can talk about. Let's put it that way.
Well, I mean, I get involved in doing some projects that interest me, and I guess there's two things that interest me in a way at the moment. Or maybe three. So there is the sort of the whole visualization thing, but we've talked about that, so I'll park that to one side. I'm also particularly interested in how historic records and information that we've collected in the past can help inform and influence our decision making going forward. I was involved in classifying building ages when I had my own business in geoinformation, but moving on from that, we've been looking at ways in which you can create essentially a utility infrastructure baseline date. So when was the road originally tarmacked? When did they lay down the pipes and stuff? We did a project going quite a long way back now, but with a gas company to identify leakage. And it's not the main pipes through the roads that are the problem, it's the connections to the houses. So if the houses are older, or the road was laid down in the 20s or something, then you've got a better understanding about where to look for leaks, where to prioritize your search patterns. And then they actually had a very successful project in identifying and bringing together information that would allow us to actually prevent gas leakage. And those sort of records are really important, all that historical source that we tend to ignore. So I know I've talked to Stephen about this before, but one of the things that I've been doing recently is going back with a colleague of mine, Chris Going, looking at some records from the Second World War about unexploded ordnance, which UK, yes, it is an issue, but it's not a massive issue. But in parts of the continent, of course, it's huge. And just as an example, we have just done a pilot study around Paris. The SNCF, which is the Paris Railways, are having a huge amount of investment put into them to extend the TGV network and to build a new ring of transport around Paris. Paris wasn't really bombed very much during the war, except just before the D-Day landings, when all the railway lines were heavily attacked. And identifying where those bombs fell, and therefore where there is potential for unexploded ordnance, is really significant. I'll give you an example of the significance, which isn't a France one, but it's a German one. About a year ago, maybe a bit more, they found a big, very big bomb. It's called a tall boy, 1,000-pounder, in Frankfurt, in the center of Frankfurt, during a construction exercise. They had to evacuate 70,000 people from the center of Frankfurt for 48 hours. You can work out what the cost might be of that. Just knowing where to look and how to find these things is really important. So historic records, I think, shouldn't be discarded. And that actually is really important because it makes you think about how do you archive what you produce today. Most of what we do today is ephemeral. We look at it on a screen and it's gone. And actually the decision-making process, the way we use that data, has no way of being recorded in a way that allows us to repeat the process. And that's another fundamental problem that we've got.
Thank you, Seppe. So So thanks for sharing them examples. And you're right, obviously we've talked about them before, but I think they illustrate the power of having good information, and we talked about capturing, digitizing, and then reusing. And it's basically problem solving, isn't it? And I think that's the challenge for some people in, maybe outside of geospatial or new to these disciplines. It's just about, ultimately, it's about problem solving. What is the problem and what are the capabilities? And of course, because it's your whole career. But I think that's the challenge, isn't it? When we move away from the free to use or say lightweight tools, let's put it that way, sort of web mapping is what I'm implying. The capabilities are not fully understood of other people, not in a GIS profession either. And both the examples you gave, obviously there's lots of different disciplines there, like digitization, interpretation.
Yeah, there's loads. I mean, there's loads of examples. We went in the UK. We had a particular interest in contaminated land for a while, back in the middle of the noughties. It was, and it just as I'll give you one example because it just always strikes me. It's the one that I tend to quote when I talk to people. And so I live in Cambridgeshire, South Cambridgeshire, and we had, like most places, a lot of, during the Second World War, a lot of the fields were grubbed up. A lot of the hedgerows disappeared. But in doing that, they also grubbed up a lot of the farm tracks and so on. What they've discovered recently is asbestos in some of the land areas. Why? Well, when they look back into the records, you find that there was a brickworks in a particular area. And every time they cleared out the asbestos lining of the kilns, they crashed it all up, gave it to farmers to lay down for tracks. Those have now been grubbed up and spread across fields. So you have an ongoing contamination issue or potential contamination issue. There's endless amounts of stories like that. I mean, some of them would really make the hairs on the back of your neck stand up. But it's only by using the historic records and knowing that we were actually very good at keeping those records that we're able to come up with some solutions to some of those problems.
So thank you. It's a very good example because often it's about, we've talked about sort of communication, the visualization bit, without actually using that word directly. And now we're talking about sort of, if you like, future proofing and records keeping. And I think your point was very pertinent that you said about what we do, or a lot of the data now is ephemeral. I think absolutely you're right. I mean, the amount of times I've said to clients, maybe we need a record set, as in a map, perhaps in that case, and they go, what do you mean? I'll go, well, we need a PDF. Or I think it's quite interesting that the examples that you're talking about only exist because they're paper. Now if they were on some of the first versions of PDFs, I mean, you'd be able to convert them, but I suspect a lot of people wouldn't be able to convert things. But
at least they would have it. At least they'd have it. I mean, so much stuff. There will be records of Ordnance Survey's master map editions every so often, and other map publishers will make them available to National Archives. But when people take those, add it with something else, mash it up in some way, and create some really interesting, innovative analysis, they go, that's great, take the answer, walk away, and throw the analysis away. And actually, we're losing all of that information.
So there's something about records as maybe not necessarily, well, depending. I mean, I know people that do it for a profession. Records keeping might not be to some people. I think maybe that's not the right word, but archiving, records keeping, that element still is, you raise this, and I often don't give it as much thought as I should. You're right, because even if we had all the metadata in the world, and which we don't, but if we did, we still don't have enough thought on that records keeping or the persistent.
There is a really important point to it, I think, because the assumption is I take a data set and another data set and I mash it together and I create an answer, that answer is right. And going back to the metadata, the answer is never right. It's never black or white. There's always a grey tone in there somewhere about the accuracy, the quality, the consistency of that data that may actually influence the answer we've got out, and therefore how we make a decision using it. And if we at some point think, oh, I've got that wrong, if I haven't collected all of the information along the process, I've got to go back and start again. It's not a repeatable process. And I think a lot of these ought to be much more repeatable processes.
Yeah, and linked, and it segues in. Not that I want to go too much on it, but it does segue into things like digital twins. I mean, or common data environment. So again, for people that aren't familiar, that's a formal term that's standardized in an international standard called ISO 19650, which is around BIM information management for the built environment. But again, a common data environment, that is about having a persistent data store with metadata and change and auditability. So the concepts are not new, but the language around it and the fact it's becoming mainstream is new-ish.
I think all those issues are not, none of them are new, but we do sort of repackage them with different phrases, and of course the technology allows us to address them in different ways. But we tend not to really want to put the effort into addressing it too much. We're slightly worried about the implications of what that means. Opening up a can of worms that actually once they're out the box, we can't do anything about them. So it is a bit of a worry that this whole idea of not. I suppose the obvious example actually is open data. That is OpenStreetMap data. It's fantastic. A lot of it is really good. It's mapped places that have never been mapped before. But what do you know about the person that compiled any bit of that data set? Nothing really. And it's not consistent from one to another, but you've got no way of really knowing how to use that in any sort of analytical type process. And that's why many organizations don't use it, because it's the uncertainty of its consistency, its currency, and so on. And I know they're trying to address all that, but by its very nature, that's very hard to do.
Yeah, it's the scalability, isn't it? We've touched on sort of the technology that we're both involved with, but the ability to automate things and then at scale, you introduce these challenges around, are things repeatable and are there risks in it? I think just moving on, if we can, just generally around, you mentioned sort of data, information, and then we didn't use the word insights, but you did talk about knowledge, so that implied we were talking about the Gartner insight triangle, or the triangle. I think just almost a silly question, but did clients used to talk about that? I mean, because you remember, this is about better information management. That is the number of this podcast. You mentioned the difference between data and information, quite rightly. Was that ever a challenge? Was that something you would talk about with clients? Was it a big deal? Was it?
It's a big deal. It is a big issue, and often the people we were dealing with directly understood the problem, and their problem was communicating that through the wider organization. And we were dealing with a lot of public bodies, police forces, fire brigades, government agencies, and the geospatial technician or the mapping GIS person, they understood that, and but they had trouble communicating that. And often we got involved in doing presentations and seminars internally to encourage people to understand the difference about what was happening, how if you collected a bit of data, what might happen to that within the internal systems, and what was the consequence in terms of the information that came out the other end and the decision that was going to be made. So I give you an example. I don't think there's anything secret about this. We work with the London Borough of Harrow, for example, to rework their grounds maintenance system, which was all about understanding where all the activity needs to take place, the cutting of the verges or the trimming of hedges, and how that was processed through into the way that they worked. And they wanted to update the whole system. And of course, most people's fears were updating means cutting jobs or reducing, which actually that wasn't the plan. The plan was actually to make the whole thing more efficient so they could do more. They could actually do it better rather than saving money. And I think the whole communication process of getting everybody to buy into it took a lot of effort, both internally within the organization and our involvement as well.
Yeah,
and there's lots of examples like that. I mean, people are reluctant to embrace some of these technologies if they see them as a threat or a challenge.
I completely agree with you. That change management piece, or whatever people want to call it, the people aspect, is the thing that I spend most of my time on. However, that's often not the gig. That's not the contract. The contract is data or information systems or something like that. And I completely agree. You've some of the topics I was going to maybe introduce, and you've naturally come to them. So things like process. How do we measure sort of effectiveness, efficiency, outcomes, value? Again, you gave an example there where you're making clear you're optimizing a business process. In that case, it happened to be some kind of asset maintenance regime, but it's tangible, isn't it? It's an outcome, it's measurable, time on task, and it's a process. Have you got anything to add? I know that specific example was this, but have you got anything to add around process optimization or workflow optimization? Because again, professionals like yourselves, obviously that's a key part of what you do, but surprisingly, others I speak to, it's the actual process isn't a focus. But that's what it's about, right? I mean, have you got anything to add about process optimization?
I think, I mean, coming from a company who were doing data collection and turning it into some level of information, it was extremely important that we understood exactly where everything came from. So we created this UKMap database. It covered the whole of London. And just to give you a context of the size, it was about 15 million polygons. And for each polygon, there was about 120 attributes. So we had to be able to track all of that back so that for any given polygon, we could tell you when it was last updated, who collected it, how they collected it, what the sources were. And then as we went through and changed things, we had to have all that process in place. So we were very familiar with that. But often when we gave the data over to somebody, they just had it sitting there. And one of the problems I think geospatial data suffers from is that it's often not seen as something essential now. I'll use it for this little problem, but then I'll just park it away. And next time I get a problem, perhaps I'll go and delve into it, rather than seeing something that's an integral part of a longer term planning process. Sometimes people use data for reasons that are completely unexpected from why they bought it. I'll give you another example. We had, so one of our clients was the Met Police. They had the UKMap database and they had it alongside Ordnance Survey Master Map, and they used the two together. When there were the riots in Croydon, they were going around door to door because there was some fires set in some of the retail areas because they wanted to find out whether people were living above shops. Within our database, we had made an interpretation of that. It wasn't a guarantee, that was the only source of that information, and that allowed them to actually deploy people to actually go and knock on doors. Because they had it and someone knew about it, they could use it, but it wasn't integrated into any system or any way of, being able to be used in a much more effective way. I'm not sure that really answers the question, but it gives an example of some of the problems that you get.
Sorry to talk over it. It absolutely does, because it's a tangible example of the use. I think the use case, it's solving a problem. It's a tangible example. Again, there's a lot of people out there who find it difficult to articulate. It's almost like we're backward engineering things in other scenarios. Like, what problem are we? Do you know what I mean? We can't actually pin down what the problem is, if you like, or the problem statement. Now that's obviously not the case in the examples you've given, because it was clearer. We have a challenge, you fix it in that way, and you owned a business, and nonsense you'd get to the point.
They didn't acquire the data because that was the problem, and I suppose that's the point I'm trying to make. You actually sometimes need to hold things and resources that you don't actually quite know how you're going to use them, because you actually don't know what the problems are yet. We went through the same exercise for the Olympics. We provided the data. There was lots of lots of what if scenarios that the data could have been used for. And so actually sometimes you need to think that actually maybe I need these resources. I need to invest in them because actually they will potentially help me solve problems, but I haven't yet got those problems to solve. Now that means investing up front. And of course that is a very difficult, that's a difficult discussion to have with the budget holders. So
I was just going to the answer might, given that you have military background, we're talking about the Met Police, it's probably an easier business case to make with given operational scenarios that can be discussed. But I think, again, for other people, it's harder to make that case because it's like, maybe this will happen or maybe that. But have you got anything to add just about making the case of, or any advice, let's say advice to someone who's new to our sector or starting out in GIS or cartography? How do we, on a very high level, just to begin with, to make the value or make the business case for investment in the, even if it's in the data, and then the implication is the technology and skills.
Yeah.
What would you start with? So it could be any sector.
Yeah, I mean, I'll give you an example. So latterly we sold a lot of data into the insurance market because they wanted to understand the risk in terms of house insurance, basically. And in order to persuade, so the people that we were initially discussing these things with within the insurance company were very familiar with what they could do, but they were struggling by banging their head against this sort of ceiling where the senior manager were going, I don't really get it, and I don't know whether we should put significant money into this process. So we got involved, and what we were doing really is picking out very small little nuggets of things that we thought they would appreciate and understand and go, okay, so if I spent that amount of money, I could solve that little problem. That's valuable. That's worth knowing about. So it's a huge amount of communication with the senior management, with the budget holders, and broadly. And then gradually more people started putting in solutions. Oh, this is a problem I've got. I think I could use that, and maybe I could use that. And then it grows. And then you get the internal sort of internally you get enough energy that people then go, look, we've got to have this. And then it becomes something that gets embedded. Once it's embedded, then you can start building the cases out and grow it, because it's just the business is committed to it.
Yeah, and you mentioned solutions. I think that was a turning point for me. Not people don't want to hear about me, but anyway, in my career, where I thought about it as a services. What we did, it happened to be a GIS, a mapping function, but what were the services which happened to have map and analysis, spatial analysis as an output? But guess what? There were loads of other things that could be served up through so I think that shift made a big difference. And I think maybe there aren't, this is just an observation, I don't know that it's a question, but maybe I wouldn't know necessarily where to get case studies, I think, if I wasn't. Is there anywhere out there? I mean,
it's difficult. You know, case studies has always been a difficult thing to put together. When I was in publishing, we were always looking for people to put case studies together. And we really wanted people to say, this worked really well, this didn't work so well. Nobody wants to admit to their failures, that something hasn't gone the way they expected, that they spent money that didn't give them a return. Nobody really wants to talk about the really successful case studies because they think they might be giving something away to the competition or to other people in an organization. People are very proprietary about these things. Case studies are really difficult. I mean, the best thing is to just go to a conference, listen to someone who touches on a case study, and afterwards just go and pin them down and say, let's have a coffee, tell me in detail about the issues. Because that's how you get the one-to-one issues, I think. What problems did you have? How did you solve it? Maybe I can learn that lesson and take it back to my organization.
I think that's really good. And I realize that we'll be coming toward the end of the time. So I think you mentioned conferences. Maybe we'll come on to where people can find more information online. Anything we've mentioned, by the way, any site or any reference that I can link to, I will do that already. But are there any events, again, people may be new to this, any event, like either physical or virtual events you'd recommend to learn more?
There are events. I mean, there's a lot of, the one thing about the geographic space is there's lots of organizations involved in it. So British Cartographic Society, the Association for Geographic Information, we've mentioned those two, the Royal Geographical Society, the Remote Sensing and Photogrammetry Society, and so on. And there's people in the surveying space and so on. We all have overlapping, interests, really. We all run little one-day conferences or something similar. There's some big road shows. Probably the biggest one in the UK is GeoBusiness. There's a lot of talks on the exhibition floor that once you're in, you get it for free. So I would sort of start somewhere like that, or go and have a look on some of these websites, some of these organizations, and see what their conferences are putting up. If they've got speakers, you think, that's for You know, I don't know. That's from a utility, you know, and I'm in a utility. Maybe I can learn from them, see what they're offering.
Yeah, thank you. I think the advice about the vertical or the industry may be apparent to us, but I don't think it is to a lot of people to actually talk to someone in that vertical or that industry to reach out. And a lot of people don't do that. I'm quite surprised. I'll often go to vertical or industry events and learn a lot as well. But and just again, so thanks for your insights today. And just because we're coming to the end, where would, I think we're probably going to know the few that we're going to mention, but just can you remind people what websites or resources you would recommend people go to?
Well,
just a handful, and if you think of any more,
I think I would go to look up the organisations. I think the British Cartographic Society, which I know because I've been present, I can say it's cartography.org.uk. I would go to the Association for Geographic Information. That's a good site to go on. If you're more on the surveying side, there are a number of surveying, but RICS, Royal Institute of Chartered Surveyors, go and have a look at their land survey division and what they're doing. I'd also go and have a look at some of the publications. And in the UK, probably the one I would go for is GeoConnections. I will admit that I write for that as I do a regular column for that in terms of an opinion piece. But they have a range of what's going on in the industry, and it's all online. It's all PDF format. It's easy to access. So there's a lot out there. I think what you've got to recognise about geography, John Major, when he was Prime Minister, was approached about doing something for the geographic industry. And he turned around and said, oh, that's the industry that speaks with many voices. Come back when you've sorted out how to represent yourself. And it never has. It's always been many organisations with overlapping interests. So it depends where you're coming from.
Thanks, Seppe. I was in the process of wrapping up there, but just very, very lightning two questions. What have you got anything to say about the Geospatial Commission?
I think it's brilliant that the government is involved in it. Its challenge is making itself relevant to the applications that people use. It's really important that central government have embraced the geospatial industry and want to make it work within government. And I think, I mentioned geography profession, that's all part of that. They're linked together. But they do have to work out how they deliver some results that have an impact on the way geospatial in the UK moves forward.
Great, thank you. And the last, I was going to say throwaway, but very serious yet but brief, is digital twins. Now, do they get talked about at things that you go to? Just, we don't need to dissect what they are. I'm just interested. Does the term,
not
is it
really? But you know what, terms come and go, don't they? All these things, and if you delve into what it really means, you go, well, that was called something else. We weren't talking, geospatial wasn't a term 10 years ago or 15 years ago. And when I started, GIS, became the term. That was the most exciting thing, geographic information systems, things move. But actually, if you look at the fundamentals underneath, the principles, we're still working to the same principles. We rebadge it, we repackage it and put it out there again. And then, of course, we think we reinvented the wheel. But actually, if you go back, you find that those longer in the tooth again. So okay, we've been there before. We do need to revisit it, and it's not a bad thing to call it something new, but it is actually, there's some old principles there that you can learn from and actually learn from what's gone on in the past.
Seppe, perfect. That naturally is a fantastic ending to encourage people to look around and seek out case studies and maybe speak to people who have I was going to say been around a bit, but have maybe more experience in some areas is probably the better way of putting it. But thank you so much for your time and your insight and sharing, particularly for sharing the case studies that you did as well, because it makes it tangible to people. That was the other thing I wanted, was not just to talk about with everybody about the data and technology, but the case studies. So thank you so much for sharing them. That was really great. Yeah. So thank you very much for your time, Dr. Seppe Cassettari, and I'll close it there. So thank you.
Thank you very much.